Welcome to Sarasas Samutson School. This is Science M-1 and my name is Teacher Carla Circolado. So we will start our lesson for today by reading our vocabulary words. So listen carefully as I read the first set of words. Ovules, ovules. Stamen, stamen. Multiply, multiply. Now repeat after me. Ovules, stamen, multiply. Very good. Now listen again as I read the second set of words. Seeds, seeds. Pollination, pollination. Primary, primary. Now repeat after me. Seeds, pollination, primary. Very good. Now listen again as I read the third set of words. Cell, cell. Transfer, transfer. Reproduction, reproduction. Now repeat after me. Cell, transfer, reproduction. Very good. Now let's do our dictation for today. Bring out your piece of paper, your notebooks. Write the activity number, the date, the month, and the year. Okay, let's begin. Number 1. Spell the word ovules. Number 1. Ovules. Number 2. Spell the word reproduction. Number 2. Reproduction. And number 3. Spell the word seeds. Number 3. Seeds. Now let's check your work. Bring out your red pen. If your answer is correct, please put 1. If your answer is incorrect, please copy the correct answer. Okay, let's try to answer and practice reading and spelling. Now let's read together. Number 1, ovules. O-V-U-L-E-S. Ovules. Number 2, reproduction. R-E-P-R-O-D-U-C-T-I-O-N. Reproduction. And number 3, seeds. S-E-E-D-S. Seeds. Very good. Okay, now let's move on to our topic for today, which is still in Unit 1, Plants. If you have your books, open it on page 8. We will talk about reproduction, pollination, and fertilization. Okay, so pollination and fertilization is a process of reproduction that involves two main structures of a plant. Okay, so the two main structure of a plant that involves in pollination and fertilization is the male parts, which is called stamens, and the female parts, which is called pistil. Okay. So the male parts has anther and filament. Okay, so this is the anther, or the top part of the filament. And in the female part, we have the stigma, or the upper top part of the female part, okay, or what we call the style. And inside the reproduction is the ovary, okay, so inside this one is the ovary, okay, and inside the ovary we have the ovules. Okay, so that's the part of the female part, which is the pistil. Okay, now let's see a whole picture of a flower or flowering plant. Okay, so this is the male part, which is the stamen. Okay, we have the filament and we have the anther, okay, on top of the male part. Okay, this is the anther. Next, for the female reproduction, we have the ovary. We have the ovary. This is the ovules. And we have the style here. This is the style. And the top one is called the stigma. Okay, so the female part is called pistil and the male part is called stamens. Okay, now let's move on. Let's talk about first the pollination. Okay, repeat after me, everyone. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the male structure of a plant to the female structure of a plant. Very good. So, it simply means that the anthers has the pollen grains. The pollen grains transfer or lands on the stigma or the female structure of a plant. Okay, so same as this one, in the same plant or other plants. Okay, so as you can see, we have the pollen grains in the anther, then going to the other plant's stigma. Okay, the pollen grains will transfer to the stigma. That's what we called pollination. Okay, we will talk about it more because we have two types of pollination. We have the self-pollination and the cross-pollination. We will first talk about the self-pollination. Okay, the self-pollination happens when the pollen that lands on the stigma is from the same plant. Okay, so we can take a look at this picture first. Okay, so this is one plant. Okay, with two flowers. Okay, with two flowers. From the word self, okay, it pollinates itself. Okay, how? First one, as you can see, this is the anther. The pollen grains is transferred in the stigma of the same plant. Okay, it can happen that way. Next one, when the pollen grains from this flower transfer to another flower stigma. Okay, even if it's in different flower, but this flower is just in one plant. As you can see, it is connected, right? So, when the pollen grains transfer to this stigma of another flower, it is still called self-pollination. Okay, how did it happen? How can that happen? There's an agent, okay? The agents can be air or water. So when the air flows, we can see the flowers are moving, right? Outside. So the pollen grains can actually get into the stigma. Same as this one. When the air flows, the pollen grains from this flower can go inside this stigma of the same plant but different flower. Okay, it can also happen to the aquatic flowers in the water. Okay, so that's called self-pollination. Now let's talk about the other one, which is called the cross-pollination. So, how does it happen? It happens when the pollen lands on the stigma is from a different plant. Okay? So, for example, this plant and this plant is separate, right? It's not the same plant. Okay, when the pollen grain from this plant transfer or crosses and landed here on the stigma, it's called cross-pollination, okay? When the pollen grains from this plant transfer to another flower stigma. Okay, how that happen? Okay, so we have also agent for cross-pollination. It can be insects like bees and butterfly or even birds. Okay, because the butterfly and other insects, they eat the nectar of a flower. The nectar is stored here. Okay, it's very sweet and they stored at near the ovary of a flower. So when they go inside the flower, the pollen grains will stick to their bodies. Okay, we can see another picture. As you can see, this bee is eating the nectar of a flower. The pollen grains is actually in its body. So when this bee eats the nectar here and stick the pollen grains to its body and fly to the other flower, some pollen grains will land on the stigma. Okay, so that's what we call the cross-pollination. So bees are very important for the process of cross-pollination. Okay, so after the successful pollination of a plant, we will now move on to the next process, which is the fertilization. Okay, so fertilization is where male's pollen grains fuse together with the female's ovules inside the ovary. And then it will become one new cell. Okay, so let's try to explain it, okay? So, the male pollen grains, which is called the male gametes, okay? The gametes has the sex cell of a plant, okay? So, we have the male gametes and the female gametes, which is the ovary, okay? When they fuse together, they will then form the zygote. Okay, zygote will then develop as a new individual, which is called the embryo. Okay. Okay, how that happen? How does that happen? Okay, let's see the female reproduction of a plant here. So the pollen grains is already in the stigma, right? The pollen grains need to reach the ovary or the female gamete. Okay? So for that to happen, it will go down by the pollen tube, which is produced by the pollen grain. Okay? So going down, the male gamete is going down and reaching for the female gamete. or the ovary. So it reaches already the egg, okay, or the female gamete. Okay, then it will fuse together and they will unite and form what we call zygote. Okay, so that when zygote is already formed, that marks the fertilization stage. Okay, did you understand? So fertilization is when the male gametes or the pollen grains reach the female gamete, which is the ovary, and they fuse together and form zygote. That is fertilization. Okay, so after pollination or fertilization, the ovary, when it mature or after fertilization, the ovary will then become a fruit, okay? Then the ovule inside the ovary will then become a seed, okay? Ovary become fruit and ovules become seeds. Okay, after pollination and fertilization, the ovary will mature and develop a fruit. We can see from the pictures here below. Okay, so from flower, they pollinated already. And as you can see, they already formed the zygote and embryo and developed to the new organism. And then the ovary forming or developing as a fruit. Okay, so it's developing to a fruit. Then the ovule is also developed inside as a seed. Then the process is complete. Now the ovary become a fruit and the ovules become the seeds in the fruit. Okay, now let's move on to our exercise. Bring out your paper or your notebooks and write activity number, the date, the month, and the year. Okay, we will do enumeration. You have to enumerate the items that are asked. Okay, for example, 1 and 2, enumerate what are the plants of stamens or the male part of a plant. Give the 2 parts of stamens. Okay, next, enumerate 3 and 4. Enumerate the parts of pistil or the female part of a plant. What are the parts of pistil? 3, 4, 5. What are the parts of pistil? Okay, next, still enumeration. 6, 7. What are the types of pollination? 6 and 7. What are the types of pollination? Okay, let's do the summary. We talk about the reproduction, which is the process of pollination and fertilization. We talk about the 2 structure of pollination and fertilization, which is the male and female parts of a plant, stamen and pistil. And we talk about the types of pollination, which is the self-pollination and the cross-pollination. We talk about the fertilization process after the pollination is complete. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Hope you all learned today. Just a reminder, don't forget to wash your hands, wear your mask, stay at home, eat healthy, and we will see you soon. Goodbye.